the first creatures that tried to crawl onto land. Beneath a sky heavy with ancient clouds, shallow rivers glimmered like liquid mirrors across the Devonian landscape, concealing creatures on the verge of transformation. In murky waters, fins flexed against gravity for the first time, testing boundaries that had confined life for millions of years. Muscles, skeletons, and senses adapted in secret, experimenting with land before it became a home. Shadows flickered across mudflats as bodies lifted tentatively, each movement a gamble against collapse and desiccation. This is the story of those first audacious crawlers, animals daring to leave water behind and the world they began to claim. Tiktaalik roseae, where fins first bore weight. Along the braided channels of Devonian river systems, where fresh water spread thinly across floodplains before retreating again, a broad-headed predator lingered at the edge of two physical realities, shaped by water yet increasingly tested by gravity. Around 375 million years ago, these low-oxygen, sediment-choked environments fluctuated between submerged calm and exposed instability, creating conditions in which survival favored bodies capable of pressing upward as much as swimming forward. Tiktaalik roseae did not emerge from this world as a sudden leap toward land, but as a measured response to it, molded by shallow waters where buoyancy was unreliable and the bottom itself demanded contact. The fossil remains of Tiktaalik, uncovered on Ellesmere Island in the Canadian Arctic, reveal an animal roughly 2.5 meters in length, with a flattened skull that signaled a dramatic shift away from the streamlined profiles of open water fishes. Its eyes sat atop the head rather than along the sides, an arrangement consistent with ambush predators inhabiting shallow water, where scanning above the surface provided access to prey silhouetted against air and light. This cranial design alone situates Tiktaalik within a very specific ecological niche, one where the boundary between submerged and exposed environments was navigated repeatedly rather than avoided. Beneath that flattened skull lay one of Tiktaalik's most consequential innovations, a neck. Unlike earlier lobe-finned fishes whose skulls were rigidly fused to their shoulder girdles, Tiktaalik possessed a mobile connection that allowed the head to move independently of the body. This anatomical separation, subtle in appearance but profound in implication, enabled the animal to lift its snout above the waterline while the rest of its body remained supported below. Such mobility would have allowed Tiktaalik to breathe air more effectively, scan its surroundings without repositioning its entire mass, and stabilize itself in shallow pools where movement stirred clouds of sediment. The internal architecture of Tiktaalik's pectoral fins provides the clearest evidence that these behaviors were not incidental but structurally supported. Within each fin, bones homologous to the humerus, radius, and ulna formed a robust framework capable of transmitting force downward rather than merely backward. These elements articulated with joint surfaces that permitted flexion and extension, creating a mechanical system suited to pressing against a solid substrate. Although true digits were absent, the fin rays extended beyond this internal skeleton, forming a paddle-like surface that combined strength with stability. Crucially, the distal end of the fin included a rudimentary wrist-like joint, allowing the fin to bend against the ground while the body was lifted above it. This configuration suggests that Tiktaalik could perform a push-up-like motion, elevating its head and chest while keeping its belly close to the riverbed. Such movements would have been invaluable in environments where oxygen-poor water made aquatic respiration inefficient, as well as in shallow channels where brief exposure to air carried fewer risks than in open terrestrial settings. Respiration itself marked another transitional feature, as Tiktaalik possessed both gills and lungs, a dual system reflecting the unstable chemistry of Devonian freshwater habitats. Geological evidence indicates that these environments frequently experienced hypoxic conditions, particularly during warm periods when microbial activity consumed dissolved oxygen. Lungs provided an alternative pathway for gas exchange, allowing Tiktaalik to supplement aquatic breathing with atmospheric oxygen whenever its head broke the surface. This capability did not free the animal from water, but it expanded the range of conditions under which it could remain active and alert. The ribs of Tiktaalik further underscore its relationship with gravity, as they were larger and more overlapping than those of its fully aquatic predecessors. Such reinforcement would have helped support the internal organs when the body was partially lifted from the substrate, preventing collapse under its own weight. While these ribs were not yet sufficient for sustained terrestrial locomotion, they represent an early solution to the problem of structural support outside buoyant environments, showing that load-bearing challenges were being addressed incrementally rather than all at once. Sedimentological analysis of the rock layers preserving Tiktaalik fossils paints a picture of slow-moving streams, sandbars, and shallow channels that periodically dried or shifted course. These settings would have favoured animals capable of repositioning themselves over short distances when water receded, rather than those dependent on continuous depth. Tiktaalik's anatomy aligns precisely with this context, suggesting a lifestyle centred on frequent transitions between submerged movement and stationary bracing in marginal zones. Predation strategies likely reinforced these adaptations, as shallow water ambush hunting rewards patience, elevation, and precise head movement. With its eyes elevated and neck mobile, Tiktaalik could remain nearly motionless while tracking prey, lunging forward with minimal disturbance to the surrounding water. The ability to brace against the bottom would have stabilized these strikes, preventing recoil or drift in environments where footing was uneven and currents unpredictable. What Tiktaalik did not possess is as informative as what it did, because despite its advanced fins and reinforced skeleton, it remained fundamentally a fish. The absence of digits, the continued reliance on fin rays, and the retention of a largely aquatic body plan indicate that this animal was not walking onto land, nor was it attempting to leave water behind. Instead, it occupied a behavioural middle ground, exploiting the advantages of shallow, air-adjacent habitats without committing to the hazards of full terrestrial exposure. This distinction matters because it reframes the narrative of land invasion as a gradual redistribution of functions rather than a single defining moment. In Tiktaalik, weight-bearing emerged not as a means of travel across land, but as a tool for interacting with unstable environments where water alone no longer guaranteed survival. Its fins bore weight not to cross landscapes, but to endure them, holding the body aloft long enough to breathe, observe, and strike. The evolutionary implications of this shift extend beyond Tiktaalik itself, as the mechanical solutions it embodied established a foundation upon which later forms could build. Once fins were capable of bracing against gravity, the question shifted from whether bodies could be lifted at all to whether they could be moved deliberately and repeatedly across solid ground. In that subtle change of emphasis, from support to propulsion, lay the next transformation waiting to unfold, as other bodies began to reconfigure limbs not just to press upward, but to carry themselves forward into environments where water no longer followed. Acanthostega gunari limbs before land. From that foundation of braced fins and partial elevation, another body emerged that carried limbs far further than its environment seemed to require, revealing that evolution often prepares tools long before it defines their purpose. In the late Devonian world that followed Tiktaalik, the problem was no longer whether a body could press upward against gravity, but whether new anatomical possibilities would find a reason to leave water at all. Acanthostega gunnari occupied this uncertain interval, inheriting the mechanical groundwork of weight-bearing structures while remaining firmly embedded in an aquatic reality that did not yet reward terrestrial movement. Acanthostega gunnari lived roughly 365 million years ago within freshwater systems that spread across what is now East Greenland, forming networks of shallow channels, pools, and floodplain swamps shaped by seasonal flooding. These environments were not open shorelines with exposed ground, but densely vegetated waters where fallen plant material, tangled stems, and submerged debris created a three-dimensional maze. Survival in such settings favoured precise control of body position rather than forward speed, and it was within this cluttered aquatic architecture that Acanthostega's most striking features took form. The interplay of water depth, sediment density, and vegetation complexity created both obstacles and opportunities, challenging any animal that attempted to manipulate its body in 3 dimensions without tipping or sliding. Its limbs ended not in a minimal set of digits, but in an unexpected abundance that immediately challenges assumptions about early walking and the origin of feet. Rather than displaying the 5-digit pattern familiar in later terrestrial vertebrates, Acanthostega possessed limbs that expanded outward, forming broad, paddle-like structures at their distal ends. This surplus of digits suggests that the earliest limbs were not refined for stepping across solid ground, but for maximizing contact with irregular surfaces within waterlogged environments. Each additional digit added not only surface area, but also subtle control, allowing small adjustments of pressure and rotation that helped the animal maintain stability amid moving water and shifting sediment. Each forelimb carried 8 distinct digits, arranged in a fan-like spread that prioritized surface contact over directional stride, creating a structure better suited for gripping, stabilizing, and maneuvering than for pushing a body forward. The digits lacked the compact alignment and reinforced joints necessary for bearing full body weight, instead forming flexible extensions that could press against vegetation or the substrate. Such a configuration would have allowed Acanthostega to hold itself in place amid currents or shifting sediments, preventing unwanted drift while remaining submerged. Comparative studies with modern analogues, such as polypterid fishes, suggest that limbs of this kind could have provided both rotational and lateral control, essentially functioning as stabilizing outriggers in complex habitats. Joint construction reveals why these limbs, despite their complexity, could not yet function as weight-bearing supports beyond water, because the articulations between limb bones remain poorly suited for sustained compression. The elbow and wrist regions lacked the robust, interlocking surfaces seen in later tetrapods capable of terrestrial locomotion, limiting their ability to resist gravitational stress. When removed from the buoyant support of water, these joints would have collapsed under the animal's own mass, making prolonged excursions onto land biomechanically unviable. Yet the mere presence of these partially flexible, multi-digit limbs indicates an evolutionary experiment in manipulating the environment with skeletal appendages that could one day support full terrestrial locomotion. Respiration tells an equally revealing story, because alongside lungs capable of processing atmospheric oxygen, Acanthostega retained well-developed internal gills. This dual respiratory system indicates that air breathing was supplemental rather than dominant, allowing short exposures to oxygen-rich air while remaining physiologically tied to water. The persistence of gills underscores that Acanthostega was not abandoning aquatic life, but adapting to environments where oxygen availability fluctuated and versatility provided a survival advantage. Geological analysis of East Greenland's Devonian strata reveals episodic hypoxia and stratified water layers, meaning that the ability to switch between gill and lung respiration was not an idle adaptation, but a critical survival trait. The environments it inhabited were thick with aquatic plants, fallen debris, and slow-moving water that rewarded gripping and pivoting rather than forward progression, shaping how limbs were used daily. Fossil evidence suggests that Devonian freshwater ecosystems were increasingly complex, with early vascular plants stabilizing sediments and creating shaded, low-oxygen conditions. In such settings, limbs functioned as tools for navigating obstacles, anchoring the body, and adjusting posture within a constantly shifting aquatic landscape. The surrounding vegetation also provided refuge from predators and a platform for ambush feeding, reinforcing the necessity of fine control over limb placement and body orientation. In such settings, limbs functioned as stabilizers and anchors, allowing the body to hold position against currents or among tangled vegetation, while the head and torso remained free to move. This ability would have been particularly valuable for ambush feeding, where remaining stationary while tracking prey reduced detection and conserved energy. Rather than serving as engines of forward motion, Acanthostega's limbs acted as points of leverage, transforming waterlogged chaos into a controllable space. The combination of digit flexibility, partial limb strength, and careful placement would have given it remarkable finesse in negotiating microhabitats that offered both food and shelter. This anatomy exposes a crucial evolutionary inversion, where structures, later essential for land, first evolved for mastery within water, overturning the assumption that limbs were invented in response to terrestrial opportunity. The presence of fully formed digits without the capacity to walk reveals that evolution does not proceed toward predetermined goals, but instead repurposes existing solutions when conditions change. Acanthostega demonstrates that mechanical complexity can arise before the ecological necessity, a paradox that illustrates how biology anticipates future challenges even before they exist. Only once limbs existed independent of walking could evolution confront the more unforgiving challenge of lifting an entire body beyond buoyancy and holding it there, a problem that Acanthostega itself never solved. Its story marks a pivotal threshold where anatomy outpaced environment, creating possibilities that waited millions of years for the right pressures to act upon them. As these limb-bearing bodies continued to evolve, the question shifted again, moving beyond the presence of digits toward whether muscles, joints, and skeletons could sustain weight in air, setting the stage for forms that would no longer rely on water to soften gravity's grip, and hinting at the dramatic transformations that would soon follow in the next generation of vertebrates. Ichthyostega, dragging a body into the air. The weight of water no longer cushioned every movement, and Ichthyostega felt gravity's persistent pull along its massive frame, reminding it that buoyancy was no longer an omnipresent ally. The shallow channels of its world were choked with vegetation, fallen stems, and shifting mud, demanding that each lift and step be deliberate. With a body more substantial than its predecessors, Ichthyostega tested every reinforced rib, every joint, every muscle against a force that had previously gone almost unnoticed in its ancestors. Here, the transition from water to land was not sudden, but measured, every excursion a negotiation between fluid support and solid resistance. Muscles coiled along a vertebral column built for resistance, enabling controlled lifts of chest and head above the mud, and yet the effort was taxing. Each vertebra acted like a spring under compression, distributing weight and preventing the torso from collapsing under its own mass. Even a single elevation required coordination of multiple muscle groups, a delicate choreography that balanced strength and flexibility. In these tentative movements, Ichthyostega revealed the first true dialogue between body and gravity, a conversation in which every sinew, every rib, every limb contributed to a precarious success. Its ribs stretched like internal scaffolding, bracing organs against collapse while pressing the body upward, allowing the chest cavity to lift without compromise. The overlap between successive ribs created a semi-rigid cage, transferring the load from forelimbs to vertebral column and stabilizing the spine during short terrestrial excursions. Such reinforcement was a critical adaptation, because even shallow exposures could otherwise cause crushing stress to organs designed for aquatic suspension. Here, structural design became function, and function became an opportunity to explore margins that had never before supported life in this manner. Forelimbs, thick and powerful, extended forward with cautious precision, probing the soft substrate for purchase and stabilizing the immense body with each measured push. Clawed digits spread across mud and plant stems, gripping irregular surfaces to prevent slippage. Each flex of the elbow transmitted force along the bones and into the rib-supported torso, creating a system capable of resisting partial collapse. Through these motions, Ichthyostega learned the rhythm of land, not by walking, but by dragging and lifting, testing the limits of structure and environment alike. Hind limbs responded in tandem, splaying outward to stabilize the dense trunk while the tail counterbalanced weight shifts. The tail, long and muscular, provided both leverage and balance, acting as a dynamic brace against the unstable substrate of mud-choked streams and marsh margins. Even minor shifts required constant adjustments, subtle arcs of motion that prevented tipping or rolling. The interplay between forelimb, hind limb, and tail demonstrated an early form of coordinated terrestrial mechanics, revealing the first hints of locomotion that could eventually operate independently of water. A massive trunk flexed with subtle, deliberate undulations, translating limb pressure into controlled shifts across the mud. The vertebral column's strength allowed torsional rotation, letting the body twist and pivot without compromising stability. Muscles along the back and sides contracted in waves, distributing weight evenly and adjusting for uneven terrain beneath the limbs. Even the tail contributed to these motions, acting as a counterbalance while also subtly anchoring the posterior against sliding sediment. These motions reveal that Ichthyostega's success on the muddy margins was not solely a function of limbs, but of an integrated body plan where spine, ribs, and musculature coordinated seamlessly to manage the strain of gravity outside of water. Every movement was measured, a careful negotiation between buoyancy and gravity, between fluid and firm surfaces, where a misstep could mean collapse into mud or water. The dense vegetation, submerged roots, and uneven channels created a living obstacle course, forcing Ichthyostega to adapt posture and timing continually. Muscles contracted in sequences that modern eyes would recognize as crawling motions, though every effort remained tentative and brief. In this dance of weight and support, evolution's experiment was written not in intention, but in mechanics. Shallow channels were both a highway and a hazard, with sediment layers shifting beneath pressure and plant stems resisting or yielding unpredictably. Ichthyostega learned to pivot its body, rotating with subtle shifts of limbs and tail to maintain equilibrium. Each excursion was brief, a test of endurance and balance rather than exploration or travel. This delicate control over movement foreshadowed the eventual liberation of limbs from water, demonstrating that structural preparation often precedes ecological opportunity. The body flexed and twisted in small arcs, demonstrating the earliest forms of coordinated terrestrial locomotion even if brief and laborious. Limbs pressed downward, vertebral column stiffened, ribs transmitted force, all working in tandem to allow progress across unyielding ground. Even these partial movements generated changes in muscle tone, energy expenditure, and sensory awareness, as Ichthyostega adapted to a world that was only intermittently forgiving. It was a creature caught between two realms, negotiating the constant tension of being half in water, half in air. Sensory awareness extended beyond water, as eyes scanned for predators and prey across the slippery margins of air and substrate. The head, lifted with care, could survey the flooded vegetation, while subtle shifts in pressure through its limbs informed the body of the stability of the ground beneath. Its nostrils occasionally sampled the humid air, complementing the continued reliance on submerged respiration, while every muscle fiber coordinated to balance, lift, and brace. In these moments, the narrative of land exploration was being written in real time, not in fossils, but in the struggle and adaptation of living flesh. Despite this mastery of partial land travel, the heavy-built Ichthyostega was still only testing the possibility of terrestrial life, foreshadowing creatures that would eventually make permanent excursions onto land. Its reinforced ribs and powerful vertebral column demonstrated that bodies could be lifted and supported outside of water, but movement remained short, deliberate, and exhausting. Gravity had been challenged, but not yet overcome, leaving the next generation with the template to expand mobility and independence. Even this heavy-built pioneer was not the first to leave traces of land movement, but in its laborious, deliberate strides, it carried forward the mechanical innovations that would one day allow vertebrates to claim solid earth as fully as they once claimed water. Ventostega coronica, the walker hidden in stone. Even as Ichthyostega struggled with every lift, another form slinked lightly along the flooded margins, its body poised for subtle exploration. Shallow channels and marshy edges were densely woven with plant stems, fallen branches, and tangled roots, forming a shifting labyrinth where missteps could plunge the body into mud or water. Ventostega's frame was smaller and more agile than its heavier cousins, yet it carried hints of the weight-bearing innovations that had begun to emerge in earlier tetrapods. Each motion was deliberate, a careful negotiation of balance and force, testing the interface between body and environment while probing margins that were neither fully aquatic nor fully terrestrial. Forelimbs extended with careful, almost deliberate grace, pressing against mud and soft plant stems to gauge stability. Each digit flexed independently, bending to accommodate irregularities in the substrate while providing grip on slippery surfaces. Elbows and wrists rotated with subtle control, distributing pressure across multiple contact points, preventing localized sinking or collapse. The joints permitted a sweep that coordinated with the hind limbs and tail, translating force along the torso while preserving equilibrium. These motions allowed Ventostega to explore without fully committing weight to any single point, demonstrating a nuanced understanding of support, traction, and controlled lift within a partially submerged, unstable environment. Muscles along the spine contracted in sequences that absorbed pressure and redirected weight, preventing collapse on uneven terrain. Waves of contraction rippled from the base of the skull to the pelvis, allowing the torso to twist and adjust as forelimbs and hind limbs pressed into mud or sediment. Even minor variations in water depth or plant obstruction were compensated for by these coordinated muscular adjustments. The body flexed with remarkable subtlety, balancing stability with fluidity of motion, while ribs reinforced the torso without restricting mobility. These integrated movements suggest that the animal could probe its environment with both strength and finesse, a critical step in bridging aquatic and terrestrial worlds with controlled experimentation rather than brute force. The tail traced gentle arcs, balancing shifts of the torso and limbs while navigating shallow, tangled waterways. Its movement was not solely a propulsion mechanism, but a dynamic stabilizer, responding to subtle lateral shifts and uneven substrate. When mud or decaying vegetation threatened to trap the posterior, the tail adjusted continuously, shifting weight backward to prevent tipping or rolling. Even minor oscillations of the tail created compensatory changes in torso orientation, helping distribute force evenly. This delicate counterbalance enhanced coordination between all limbs, permitting cautious exploration across semi-solid ground and providing a living demonstration of how body, spine, and appendages co-evolved to meet the demands of marginal terrestrial environments. Each digit flexed independently, allowing precise adjustment to irregular surfaces while enhancing control over posture and weight distribution. Clawed tips pressed into soft mud or roots, spreading the load across multiple points to prevent sinking. Subtle rotations at the joints permitted the limbs to act almost like sensory probes, feeling substrate resistance, curvature, and stability. These tactile interactions informed posture and orientation, enabling Venter Steger to maintain poise while moving slowly through a dynamic aquatic edge habitat. Limbs were no longer merely supportive, they were instruments of exploration, coordinating with musculature, spine, and tail to create a finely tuned system capable of negotiating the delicate balance between water and emerging land. Eyes scanned both submerged shadows and sunlit surfaces, detecting prey or predators while monitoring environmental stability. The head rotated independently, allowing simultaneous observation of aquatic and aerial threats, while muscles along the neck coordinated subtle shifts to maintain balance. Light reflected from moving water cast flickering patterns across vegetation and mud, requiring constant adjustment to interpret depth and texture. This sensory feedback informed limb placement and torso positioning, creating a continuous loop between perception and action. Each movement, pause, or twist was guided by this heightened awareness, allowing Venter Steger to navigate a complex, partially terrestrial environment with precision and deliberate caution, even as the world around it shifted unpredictably. Ribs provided subtle bracing, not to bear immense weight, but to stabilize a flexible torso capable of fine adjustments with each step. The overlapping structure allowed torsional rotation without collapse, giving Venter Steger the capacity to twist, pivot, and lean without compromising internal organs. Breathing was carefully synchronized with motion, ensuring that lungs expanded and contracted in harmony with lifts and presses. Even slight misalignments could be corrected through micro-adjustments in muscle tension and posture. This integration of skeletal, muscular, and respiratory systems illustrates a design optimized for experimentation along the fragile boundary of water and land, preparing a template for creatures that would later claim solid ground with confidence. Currents whispered past its body, and every cautious push revealed the interface between liquid support and solid mud. Water buoyed part of the weight, but sediment and roots constantly resisted, forcing micro-adjustments in posture, limb placement, and spine flexion. Each pause allowed Venter Steger to gauge the stability of the substrate, while each push tested the limits of torque and balance. Subtle variations in current speed or plant density required instantaneous compensation, creating a rhythm of trial and correction that strengthened muscular coordination and refined movement patterns. In these moments, the creature became both observer and participant, adapting its body in real time to a challenging environment that was neither fully aquatic nor fully terrestrial. Movement remained deliberate and measured, revealing early experimentation with terrestrial mechanics without committing to full land traversal. Ventostega advanced slowly, limbs lifting and lowering in controlled arcs, torso flexing subtly to maintain balance, tail sweeping for stability. Coordination between forelimbs, hind limbs, and tail permitted short excursions across mud-choked channels or plant-dense shallows, demonstrating that skeletal refinement could precede habitual terrestrial locomotion. These small advances provided insight into how early tetrapods explored the margins of land, highlighting that evolutionary experimentation was not a linear progression, but a series of nuanced adaptations emerging in parallel to environmental pressures. Though it did not yet claim full land, the body's lightness and agility hinted at the threshold it would soon cross. Movements were precise, controlled, and quiet, blending strength with finesse, allowing the creature to navigate a dynamic, semi-terrestrial habitat. While some contemporaries relied on brute skeletal reinforcement, Ventostega relied on coordination, sensory awareness, and subtle body control. Each twist, lift, and push hinted at possibilities just beyond the waterline, revealing that evolution was experimenting with multiple solutions simultaneously. These silent tests of balance and mobility prepared the stage for the next generation of creatures, poised to lift themselves entirely from water and claim solid ground as their own. Panderichthys A, fish poised for shore. Sunlight filtered through the shallow margins, glinting off mud and submerged vegetation as Panderichthys glided with low, cautious grace. The shallow channels shimmered with ripples and shadows, revealing the uneven contours of sediment, submerged roots, and delicate plant stems that threatened to trap or destabilize any misstep. Its flattened head skimmed just above the waterline, allowing broad, lateral vision to monitor both the substrate and the currents. Every motion was deliberate, each fin and body segment working in harmony to test how much of the weight could be lifted and for how long, without surrendering to gravity's pull. In these subtle experiments, the animal balanced on the threshold between water and the first real hints of land. Its flattened head pressed near the waterline, surveying mud, roots, and slow currents with quiet calculation. Broad jaws and sensory pits along the skull provided both tactile and pressure feedback, helping the creature gauge the resistance of sediment beneath. Each cautious nod of the head, a rotation of the jawline, or a slight cranial tilt allowed Panderichthys to map microgradients in the mud and anticipate the behavior of the water. Submerged plants swayed under its careful approach, and the faint scent of microbial mats hinted at both sustenance and slipperiness. In this way, the head became both sensor and stabilizer, guiding the animal's next calculated movement. Pectoral fins extended outward, bracing against shifting sediment, ready to lift the body with a single, coordinated effort. Flexible joints along the fin bases permitted subtle rotation, allowing the broad appendages to anchor firmly while distributing pressure across multiple points of contact. Muscles along the base of the fins contracted in waves, producing minute adjustments to prevent tipping or sinking. With every gentle press, Panderichthys explored the limits of what its fins could support, testing how close it could bring its body above the substrate without losing balance. These fins were no longer just steering mechanisms. They had become proto-limbs, instruments for negotiating the boundary of air and water. Muscles along the back and sides flexed subtly, distributing weight and maintaining balance as the body rose slightly above the substrate. Vertebral flexion allowed micro-rotations and torsional adjustments, enabling the animal to twist and align its torso in response to soft or uneven mud. Subtle contractions along lateral muscles synchronized with fin and tail movement, allowing the body to shift weight in ways that kept it poised above the water without fully leaving it. These integrated actions transformed each excursion into a carefully measured test of body mechanics, demonstrating that rising above water was possible, controlled, and repeatable, an early rehearsal for life beyond the margins. The broad torso acted as a stabilizing platform, allowing minor twists and turns to navigate obstacles without tipping or sinking. Its width provided lateral balance, while accommodating slight dorsal flexion, preventing the body from rolling when fins pressed unevenly. Every contraction of trunk muscles, every adjustment in rib orientation, enabled the body to remain level even as mud yielded beneath a push. Plant stems and small detritus shifted underfoot. Yet Panderichthys adapted instantly, distributing forces across the torso and fins. In these moments, the body became a dynamic scaffold, balancing tension, compression, and buoyancy, showing that skeletal and muscular refinement could precede habitual terrestrial locomotion. Tail movements were controlled, not for propulsion, but to counterbalance subtle shifts in posture and center of gravity. Gentle lateral undulations synchronized with spine and fin adjustments, anchoring the rear while the forebody probed forward. When a fin pressed into soft mud, the tail shifted minutely, stabilizing the center of gravity and preventing lateral tipping. Even minor oscillations provided critical feedback, guiding micro-adjustments that allowed the animal to remain poised and precise. In these coordinated maneuvers, the tail functioned as a counterweight and sensor, revealing the sophisticated interplay between body segments long before fully functional limbs would carry animals onto land. Every fin stroke, every twist of the spine, reflected an evolutionary experiment, testing the threshold between water support and gravity's pull. Panderichthys advanced incrementally, stopping frequently to read the environment through subtle feedback from fins, tail, and head. Each forward push allowed slight elevation of the torso, an exploration of leverage and weight distribution that foreshadowed the next steps in vertebrate evolution. The animal's movements were quiet, deliberate, almost imperceptible in the shallow current. Yet each shift embodied a profound adaptation, the emergence of mechanics that would soon make terrestrial locomotion feasible. Eyes scanned both submerged shadows and the rippling surface above, integrating sensory input to guide precise body positioning. Light reflected off mud and plant stems, creating shifting patterns that demanded constant visual calibration. The flattened skull and independently movable head permitted simultaneous tracking of substrate, currents, and potential threats, allowing adjustments mid-step. By coordinating sensory information with muscle and skeletal control, the animal maintained stability while exploring its environment. These subtle interactions highlight the sophisticated, multi-level integration of anatomy, behavior, and environment in a creature perfectly poised at the edge of land. Movements remained deliberate, patient, and quiet, blending stealth with mechanical exploration in the shallow margins. Fins braced, torsos flexed, tails balanced, and heads scanned in a continuous, orchestrated rhythm. Even minor errors prompted immediate corrections, as muscles contracted and joints flexed to restore equilibrium. Each excursion lasted only moments, yet each demonstrated the potential to lift body weight partially out of water, to push and pivot with purpose, and to experiment with gravity in a controlled, repeatable manner. This patient testing of limits marks the silent prelude to full terrestrial adaptation. Bodies could now rise and brace with intention, anticipating limbs that would soon carry them entirely onto land, a promise latent in every subtle shift and push. Panderichthys remained dependent on water, yet its broad head, flattened torso, and bracing fins showed that evolution was actively exploring the mechanics of land before limbs were fully functional. Each measured lift, every torsional adjustment, hinted at the capacity for deliberate terrestrial locomotion. From these poised forms emerged animals whose limbs were no longer theoretical but functional, setting the stage for a future where vertebrates could leave water entirely behind and move across solid earth with strength and precision. Elginopeton pancheni bones, built to bear weight. The edge of the shallow waters quivered under small ripples as Elginopeton shifted its weight forward. Limbs poised for the first deliberate lift. Muddy channels stretched in every direction, interspersed with submerged roots, plant stems, and uneven sediment that threatened to destabilize even the most careful movement. Its body, broader and more rigid than Panderichthys's, flexed subtly as muscles along the torso prepared to manage the strain of lifting mass above water. Each motion was deliberate, the creature negotiating between buoyancy and gravity, balancing on a threshold where structure itself began to define the limits of possibility. In these first controlled lifts, evolution was experimenting with how much the body could bear against a world without water's support. Shoulder and pelvic structures are braced, distributing pressure across the body while testing the limits of new skeletal support. The bones of the girdles resisted bending and torsion, anchoring muscles that ran along the torso and limbs. Every subtle contraction and release allowed forelimbs and hindlimbs to act as stabilizing pillars, creating a tentative framework capable of sustaining weight in the air. The vertebral column, stiff yet flexible, provided both axial support and limited rotation, accommodating the shifting forces of movement without compromising the integrity of the torso. In this delicate balance, the first true attempts at land locomotion were quietly unfolding. Forelimbs extended, digits splayed subtly, seeking purchase on slippery mud and tangled vegetation without losing balance. The limbs flexed at multiple joints, each finger and digit acting as a small stabilizer, countering localized instability in the substrate. Every placement was a negotiation between grip and weight distribution, allowing the torso to rise fractionally above the water. These careful, repeated movements suggested that the animal was discovering the principles of load transfer, how forces could be distributed through skeletal and muscular systems to maintain equilibrium while partially unsupported by water. Axial muscles contracted along the spine, stabilizing the torso against downward sag and lateral collapse as weight shifted forward. Waves of muscular tension traveled from skull to pelvis, permitting controlled twisting and subtle dorsal flexion to compensate for uneven terrain. Even minor deviations in substrate firmness triggered instant adjustments, with limbs, tail, and torso working as a single coordinated system. In these precise contractions, the animal demonstrated that the body could bear its own mass for short bursts, proving that skeletal support alone could now challenge the limits of gravity. Hind limbs adjusted with cautious precision, responding to microvariations in substrate firmness and the subtle flow of water. Muscles contracted sequentially along the hips and thighs, transferring load evenly and minimizing the risk of sinking or tipping. Each step was a measured test, the limbs acting as both weight bearers and tactile sensors, gauging the pliability of mud and the resistance of submerged plant stems. This coordination between forelimbs, hind limbs, and axial muscles allowed small, controlled excursions, hinting at the first movements capable of sustaining the entire body weight for brief moments on solid ground. Each lift, each controlled flex of joints, measured the capacity to maintain elevation and prepare for longer excursions. Limbs alternated between bracing and adjusting, while the torso flexed subtly in response to minute shifts in the center of gravity. The tail counterbalanced every movement, preventing the body from rolling or tipping sideways. The creature's motions were deliberate, slow, and precise, a choreography dictated by both necessity and opportunity, as it explored how much its bones and muscles could sustain without aquatic assistance. The flattened body adapted dynamically, allowing subtle rotations and torsion to compensate for uneven ground beneath. Shallow depressions, small ridges of mud, and decaying plant matter demanded continuous adjustment, each step reinforcing the integration of limbs, spine, and torso. This adaptability allowed the animal to maintain poise while probing the limits of its strength, revealing that structural innovation was not simply incremental, but coordinated across multiple systems simultaneously. Such flexibility in both skeleton and musculature hinted at the emergence of new modes of movement where the body could manage its own weight with increasing autonomy. Sensory input vibrations from water, resistance from mud, and movement of nearby plants guided the precise placement of limbs and body. Eyes tracked subtle distortions in light across the water and mud, while lateral line-like structures detected pressure changes, helping anticipate instability or shifts in the substrate. The head moved independently, adjusting angle and height to integrate sensory information with ongoing motor adjustments. These combined systems, musculoskeletal and sensory, provided continuous feedback, allowing Elginopeton to act with foresight rather than reaction alone, testing the feasibility of sustained terrestrial support without the need for water to carry its weight. Motion remained deliberate, each step a test of structural endurance, not yet freedom from aquatic support, but a rehearsal of terrestrial mechanics. Every lift, pivot, and flex was an experiment in stability, coordinating every functional system to withstand gravity's pull. The shallow margins served as both stage and laboratory, where subtle forces were explored and refined, preparing the blueprint for later, more confident terrestrial vertebrates. Even brief excursions were monumental, marking the transition from supporting limbs for minor positional adjustments to managing body weight deliberately and reliably. With strengthened limbs and manageable body weight, the boundary between water and land transformed into a new evolutionary arena, foreshadowing the challenges and possibilities of life fully independent of buoyancy. Elginopeton's cautious, calculated movements showed that structural refinement alone could now allow bodies to support themselves, turning the question of survival into a matter of endurance, energy management, and physiology. The first true weight-bearing limbs had begun their work, subtly testing gravity and hinting at the next evolutionary leap, animals capable of leaving the water entirely behind, facing the terrestrial world with both skeletal and muscular resilience. Tulipeton curtum digits facing dry air. Taking the first experiments of body support a step further, Tulipeton flexed its reinforced limbs and spread digits deliberately, negotiating the shifting edge between water and land with a confidence its predecessors had not yet achieved. Shallow coastal margins stretched in every direction, a mosaic of mud, sand, and plant debris that flexed and shifted under each step. Muscles along the torso and limbs contracted in measured sequences, allowing the body to rise fractionally above the substrate while maintaining equilibrium. These movements were no longer tentative experiments. They were deliberate excursions, testing both structural limits and the coordination required to move across partially exposed terrain. Each controlled lift whispered of the possibilities awaiting vertebrates as limbs became not only supports, but instruments of deliberate propulsion. Joints locked and released in precise sequences, distributing weight through forelimbs and hindlimbs as the torso lifted slightly above the shallow sediment. Shoulder and pelvic girdles bear the mechanical load, channeling forces from the limbs into the axial skeleton. The vertebral column flexed subtly to accommodate shifting weight, while muscles along the spine maintained posture and countered lateral sway. Each extension of the limbs demonstrated the growing sophistication of skeletal and muscular integration, allowing Tulipiton to step forward with both caution and purpose. In these early terrestrial forays, gravity was no longer a passive adversary, but an active, factor-shaping movement. Each of the 6 digits probed the yielding substrate independently, seeking purchase in mud, sand, and entangled plant matter, creating a tactile map of stability for the body to follow. The digits spread and contracted, sensing the firmness of the ground beneath and adjusting placement to avoid sinking or slipping. Forelimbs and hindlimbs alternated in subtle sequences, their movement informed by both the feedback of substrate pressure and the body's shifting center of gravity. Even a minor depression or soft patch required immediate adjustment, revealing the fine coordination necessary to negotiate an environment only partially supported by water. Through these small, precise acts, Tulipiton was not only moving, but learning the mechanics of deliberate weight-bearing locomotion. Axial muscles tensed rhythmically along the spine, maintaining balance while allowing subtle twists and shifts that compensated for irregularities in the terrain. The torso, flattened and robust, acted as a bridge between limbs, transmitting force evenly while resisting sagging or torsional stress. Movements of the head and neck complemented spinal adjustments, scanning the substrate and coordinating limb placement. These combined efforts allowed Tulipiton to lift, pivot, and advance with a fluidity unachievable by predecessors that lacked such structural reinforcement. In this choreography, the animal began to demonstrate what would become a hallmark of terrestrial vertebrates: integrated musculoskeletal control for efficient movement on solid ground. The flattened head moved with awareness, detecting vibrations from water and the gentle sway of plants, integrating sensory feedback into coordinated limb placement. Eyes tracked shifting patterns of reflected light and ripples in shallow pools, while subtle pressure changes in mud-informed posture and step timing. Lateral musculature engaged to maintain balance as forelimbs probed uncertain ground, and small adjustments in the tail countered any lateral drift. In these early excursions, sensory integration and muscular coordination worked in concert, transforming what had been an experiment in skeletal support into a more deliberate and informed exploration of land-adjacent territory. Tail and hindquarters engaged as dynamic counterweights, permitting controlled pivots and turns without sacrificing elevation or stability. Subtle lateral motions of the tail redistributed mass, allowing the limbs to flex and extend without overloading the shoulders or pelvis. Hind limbs pressed into the substrate with calculated force, supporting not only forward progression but also rotational adjustments as the torso shifted above uneven sediment. This balance of force and counterforce demonstrated a growing independence from the buoyancy of water, enabling controlled steps that stretched the boundaries of what early vertebrates could achieve at the water's edge. Forward motion became more deliberate than mere testing. Each step pushed the body into a controlled extension of terrestrial space, exploring the limits of limb and joint capacity. Flexed digits grasped the mud, forelimbs pulled the body forward, and hind limbs pressed for propulsion, creating a rhythm that extended excursions farther from submerged support. Each movement was a negotiation between stability, energy expenditure, and the risk of slipping, showcasing the functional sophistication of reinforced joints and muscular coordination. The shoreline transformed into a proving ground where structural innovation was matched by behavioral strategy, each step refining the art of terrestrial navigation. Substrate irregularities, small ridges, depressions, and soft patches forced constant micro-adjustments, highlighting the interplay of skeletal structure, musculature, and digit coordination. Every lift of a limb was a careful assessment of weight distribution. Every flex of the spine, a compensatory adjustment against the pull of gravity. Even subtle variations in mud consistency demanded a recalibration of movement, forcing the animal to balance propulsion, posture, and limb placement simultaneously. This continual negotiation emphasized that successful land experimentation required not only strong bones, but also nuanced, muscular, and sensory control, a combination that would define early terrestrial vertebrates. Every lift, push, and subtle rotation revealed that limbs were no longer passive supports, but active tools for negotiating gravity, water resistance, and uneven terrain simultaneously. Forelimbs acted as anchors, hind limbs as propulsion, and the spine as an adaptable bridge, coordinating forces for maximum efficiency. Small adjustments in digit angles and subtle shifts in body posture enabled each step to be precise and energy efficient, reducing the risk of collapse or sinking. In this way, Tulipeton transformed skeletal potential into functional reality, demonstrating that early vertebrates could exert deliberate control over movement in environments only partially constrained by water. On the ever-changing coastal margins, each of Tulipeton's measured steps pointed toward a future where vertebrates could thrive fully on land, guided by strength and coordination. Muscles, digits, and joints worked in harmony, extending excursions further than any previous form had dared. The shoreline became a laboratory, where the possibilities of fully terrestrial life were tested in miniature, each trial hinting at the evolutionary leaps to come. While these vertebrates hesitated at the water's edge, another lineage would soon reach land without bones at all, proving that the conquest of terrestrial space was not limited to those relying on limbs alone, but could emerge through entirely different forms of adaptation. Euthecasinoids, armoured crawlers of the tidal flats. On the shifting mudflats, where water lapped gently against the shore, armoured bodies pressed forward, legs moving in precise, segmented rhythms that defied instability. Each step displaced soft sediment, leaving faint impressions of coordinated motion across the damp substrate. The rhythmic press of jointed limbs transmitted force through a rigid exoskeleton, stabilizing the body against the pull of gravity and the pull of receding water. Tidal currents, though weak, added subtle resistance, forcing each crawler to adjust posture and limb angle to maintain progress. These early arthropods moved with a deliberation born of both necessity and structural ingenuity, their armoured forms glinting briefly in sunlight as they advanced along the waterline. Each articulated limb flexed with purpose, distributing weight across the exoskeleton while allowing subtle corrections for soft or uneven terrain. Legs alternated in precise sequences, creating a gait that minimized sinking while maximizing forward propulsion. Muscles anchored within segments worked in concert with hardened plates, allowing small adjustments that kept the body level despite inconsistent mud firmness. Coordination between forelimbs and hind limbs maintained momentum, while mid-body segments absorbed minor shifts in substrate, preventing tipping or collapse. Movement was a negotiation between mechanical design and environmental variability, showcasing the sophistication of early arthropod engineering. Segmented plates provided both protection and mechanical leverage, forming a rigid yet flexible framework that anchored movement on yielding mud. Armor ridges and overlapping exoskeletal segments resisted compression from the weight of the body, enabling sustained excursions across unstable ground. The design also allowed controlled flexibility, so the body could twist or arch slightly to navigate obstacles, depressions, or small pools. These creatures were not simply crawling, they were actively problem-solving at the interface of structure and environment. Each segment played a role in maintaining posture, transmitting force, and adapting to the constantly shifting tidal landscape. The exoskeleton's curvature worked in concert with limb articulation, transmitting forces along the body to optimize traction and prevent collapse. Forelimbs pressed downward, hind limbs extended backward, and the mid-body acted as a stabilizing bridge. This synergy allowed the animal to pivot or adjust direction without losing balance, even when encountering areas where water pooled or mud deepened unexpectedly. Every segment functioned as part of a larger biomechanical system, converting muscular effort into effective locomotion while protecting soft internal structures. In these movements, the delicate balance between rigidity and flexibility became apparent, a critical innovation in the conquest of partially terrestrial habitats. Antennae and sensory appendages swept across the substrate, detecting vibrations, moisture gradients, and subtle changes in surface firmness, guiding each deliberate step. Sensory feedback was continuous and integrated, influencing limb placement and body posture in real time. Small variations in sediment density or water saturation prompted immediate adjustments, allowing these arthropods to traverse surfaces that might have trapped or stalled less coordinated animals. In this way, movement was not merely mechanical but informed, as tactile perception shaped every step. The combination of armored protection and acute environmental awareness allowed them to exploit niches unavailable to vertebrate pioneers at the time. Coordinated gait patterns emerged as alternating sets of legs lifted and pressed, creating a rhythm that stabilized the body against tides and shifting sediment. Limbs moved in sequence with a silent precision, each step reinforcing the body's balance while propelling it forward. Even minor deviations in ground level prompted subtle compensations as the creature adjusted limb angles and segment alignment to maintain efficiency. These rhythmic patterns transformed the tidal flats into a dynamic stage where movement required constant interaction with the environment. Each forward crawl demonstrated a mastery of coordination, balance, and environmental responsiveness previously unseen in larger terrestrial forms. Tail-like extensions and posterior segments balanced momentum, allowing pivots and small course corrections without sacrificing forward motion. The hindmost segments flexed and shifted in response to the body's center of mass, preventing tipping during turns or on sloping mud surfaces. This adaptability allowed euthycarcinoids to explore areas that were both water-adjacent and intermittently exposed, testing the limits of early terrestrial locomotion. Muscular contractions transmitted through the posterior segments enhanced stability while facilitating small, controlled rotations. In these movements, every portion of the body was actively engaged, working together to negotiate complex microenvironments along the tidal margins. Each crawl, turn, and pause demonstrated problem-solving at a biomechanical level, as limbs and segments reacted to micro-variations in the tidal environment. Uneven sediment, shallow pools, and scattered detritus demanded continuous adjustment, forcing the animal to coordinate sensory input with muscular output. Movement became a dialogue between body and environment, each step informed by substrate feedback and the constraints of the exoskeleton. The ability to maintain forward progress in such variable conditions revealed an early form of environmental intelligence, a capacity to navigate semi-terrestrial habitats long before vertebrates would dominate them. These armored crawlers occupied niches inaccessible to heavier or less coordinated animals, exploiting damp substrates where water receded briefly but never fully disappeared. By integrating sensory awareness, limb articulation, and exoskeletal leverage, they could traverse tidal flats with both stability and precision. Their occupation of these transitional zones demonstrated that terrestrial exploration was not the exclusive domain of vertebrates. Rather, multiple lineages experimented with life at the water's edge, each employing unique anatomical and behavioral strategies. In these margins, arthropods, like euthycarcinoids, carved out spaces that would eventually influence patterns of land colonization in future lineages. Through persistent movement across tidal margins, euthycarcinoids foreshadowed a time when animals would solve the critical challenge of permanent air breathing, transforming temporary excursions into lasting terrestrial dominance. Each segment, joint and limb, contributed to a harmonious whole capable of negotiating instability with confidence. These creatures proved that survival at the water-land interface could be achieved without the skeletal lifting mechanisms of vertebrates, relying instead on armored protection, coordinated gait, and environmental perception. From these tidal explorers emerged the evolutionary foundation for terrestrial life, setting the stage for future animals that would conquer the air permanently, leaving behind water as a mere habitat rather than a necessity. Pneumodesmus pneumani, the first confirmed air breather. Amid damp soil and decaying plant matter, a tiny segmented body moved with deliberate precision, drawing air directly into its tissues for the first time. No longer constrained to the margin of water, its existence depended entirely on oxygen from the atmosphere, a feat that reshaped the possibilities of survival. Each step pressed against uneven surfaces, negotiating loose detritus, small depressions, and subtle moisture gradients. The microtopography of early terrestrial habitats challenged balance and coordination, demanding that every limb and segment work in harmony to maintain forward motion. In this modest but revolutionary feat, the first truly terrestrial animals demonstrated that life could persist wholly outside the protective buoyancy of water. Every step was informed by tactile and environmental cues, as antennae swept across the soil, sensing texture, moisture, and obstacles. Legs articulated in carefully timed sequences, distributing weight across the segmented body to prevent sinking into softer patches. Muscular contractions and cuticle rigidity provided stability, allowing controlled movement even on surfaces prone to collapse under pressure. Unlike earlier shore-bound explorers, Pneumodesmus carried its own supply of oxygen, rendering water optional rather than essential. Its independence from aquatic habitats allowed it to venture into niches inaccessible to larger, heavier animals, where moisture and shelter from predators were sufficient to sustain life. Spiracles along the dorsal surface opened rhythmically, channeling air through tracheae into internal tissues with remarkable efficiency. Oxygen was delivered directly to muscles and organs, supporting sustained activity without reliance on diffusion from surrounding water. This internal ventilation system transformed locomotion, allowing coordination and endurance previously impossible for animals of such size. In the dim, dappled light, filtering through primitive vegetation, the creature navigated mossy patches and soft soil with deliberate, almost purposeful steps. Each inhalation and exhalation reinforced its independence, establishing the physiological foundation for animals that would one day dominate terrestrial ecosystems. Segments and articulated legs worked in concert, translating muscular effort into smooth, forward progression across an unpredictable landscape. Subtle adjustments in limb angle, joint flexion, and body posture allowed the creature to negotiate slopes, depressions, and small obstacles with astonishing efficiency. Movement was no longer merely reactive, it had become anticipatory, informed by a combination of environmental perception and internal feedback. Coordination between anterior and posterior segments maintained stability, while mid-body segments absorbed minor shifts in the terrain. In these interactions, locomotion became a dialogue between body and habitat, each step refining the organism's mastery over land. Environmental awareness extended beyond mere movement. Sensory organs detected moisture gradients, guiding the animal toward optimal microhabitats where desiccation risk was minimal. Substrate irregularities prompted immediate adjustments, preventing collapse or entrapment in soft soil. The creature's keen perception of its surroundings allowed it to exploit the decaying vegetation that provided both food and protection. Small depressions became temporary refuges, while elevated patches offered vantage points to survey the immediate environment. Through continuous feedback between body and environment, Pneumodesmus transformed otherwise perilous terrain into a viable living space. Despite its diminutive size, Pneumodesmus represented a profound evolutionary leap. Unlike the heavy, limb-dependent pioneers along tidal flats or shallow waters, it required no structural reinforcement to combat gravity. Instead, physiology and efficient respiration enabled total independence from aquatic ecosystems. Its movement, though measured and cautious, demonstrated that life could thrive without partial reliance on water. In each segment and joint, evolution had encoded both resilience and flexibility, showing that terrestrial life was no longer an experiment at the water's edge, but a permanent occupation. Feeding strategies reflected its micro-scale terrestrial mastery. As it navigated soil and detritus, the creature located small organic particles, fungal matter, and decomposing vegetation, efficiently converting them into energy to sustain locomotion and growth. Sensory input guided the selection of safe paths, while environmental awareness ensured energy was not wasted in unstable or hazardous areas. Through these behaviors, Pneumodesmus occupied a niche that balanced safety, nutrition, and mobility, establishing patterns of terrestrial survival that would influence countless lineages in the eons to follow. Activity continued through subtle cycles of exploration, rest, and adjustment, demonstrating that coordination and respiration could sustain extended excursions across fully terrestrial landscapes. The tracheal system's efficiency allowed survival in variable oxygen availability and within microenvironments that could dry quickly under intermittent sun. Each movement refined motor coordination, providing feedback that improved navigation, foraging efficiency, and balance. Unlike aquatic forms, whose movements were moderated by buoyancy, Pneumodesmus relied entirely on its internal support and control, mastering gravity through physiology alone. Its small size became an advantage, allowing access to niches unavailable to larger animals and paving the way for the diversification of land-based life. Interactions with decaying matter and moisture pockets highlighted the delicate balance of terrestrial life. The animal maintained hydration and access to oxygen while avoiding desiccation, predation, and unstable terrain. Coordinated movement ensured energy efficiency, while body segmentation distributed mechanical loads during locomotion. Microhabitat mastery was both behavioral and physiological, revealing a sophisticated strategy for permanent terrestrial existence. In these small, deliberate steps, the animal exemplified the first fully functional terrestrial ecosystem participant, able to survive, navigate, and exploit its environment independently. In the first sustained forays into fully terrestrial life, Pneumodesmus demonstrated that air breathing could support not just survival, but active exploration, foraging, and reproduction. Segmentation, limb coordination, and internal respiration converged to create a self-sufficient organism capable of thriving entirely out of water. These tiny steps transformed the land from a marginal challenge into an occupied ecological stage, opening opportunities for predators and competitors alike. By mastering air as a resource and integrating physiology with environmental awareness, Pneumodesmus signaled the beginning of a new chapter in life's conquest of land. Thanks to this pioneering adaptation, the first terrestrial prey existed in abundance, inevitably drawing attention from animals capable of exploiting these new resources. The innovation of air breathing, combined with small size, coordination, and environmental awareness, set the stage for subsequent waves of colonizers who would follow into terrestrial ecosystems. Life on land was no longer tentative. It had been claimed, step by step, by these unassuming yet revolutionary animals, whose presence would reshape evolutionary trajectories and attract the first predators into an airbound world, Silurian scorpions' venom on the shore. Among the first terrestrial prey, a stealthy scorpion prowled along the damp shoreline, its segmented body gliding silently over uneven surfaces. The early sun filtered weakly through clouds and primitive vegetation, casting dappled light across tidal flats where moisture pooled in depressions. Every step required careful balance, legs coordinating with body flexion to prevent collapse on soft sediment. Each movement was calculated, muscles transmitting force through the exoskeleton to maintain stability. The air was dense with humidity, carrying faint vibrations that the creature's sensory organs could detect with remarkable sensitivity. In these first terrestrial hunting grounds, life was measured in small shifts, precise coordination, and careful negotiation of an unpredictable environment. Every movement was deliberate, with pincers poised to seize unsuspecting prey, while sensory hairs detected vibrations across the substrate. Fine hairs along its limbs and body picked up minute tremors as other small arthropods scuttled nearby, revealing the presence of potential victims or competitors. Muscular control allowed rapid strikes, yet every advance was tempered by the risk of overextension or collapse. Shadowed crevices in sediment ridges offered concealment, enabling ambush strategies that required both patience and timing. Through these calculated movements, the scorpion exploited a niche where size, speed, and sensitivity combined to create a predator unmatched in the early terrestrial world. Venom, delivered through a curved stinger at the tip of its tail, allowed the creature to subdue prey far larger than itself, marking a new strategy for survival on land. Paralysis was instantaneous, ensuring that captured prey could not escape or retaliate, even in the unpredictable terrain of coastal flats. The chemical cocktail within the stinger's secretion also began early interactions with potential pathogens, protecting both predator and prey remains. Each strike demonstrated the interplay between physiology and ecology, showing how anatomical refinement could enable dominance in a completely new realm. By mastering venom, these scorpions extended the reach of evolution beyond mere locomotion, adding aggression, precision, and lethality to the equation of survival. Shadows and irregularities in the soil provided cover, enabling ambush tactics that relied on patience, timing, and precise muscular control. The interplay of light, dampness, and microtopography defined the hunting landscape, with depressions holding moisture and raised ridges offering vantage points. Legs adjusted in microseconds, body segments flexing to accommodate uneven surfaces while remaining poised for sudden motion. In this silent theatre, every step was a negotiation between opportunity and risk, revealing that predation on land demanded far more than strength. It required anticipation and environmental mastery. Leg articulation and body flexibility allowed the scorpion to navigate cracks, ridges, and damp depressions while maintaining readiness to strike. Each joint worked in sequence, distributing weight evenly across the body to prevent sinking or tipping. The tail remained coiled but mobile, ready to deliver a defensive lash or precise attack. Even slight slopes in the substrate required careful adjustment, as the predator's success depended on both stealth and stability. Here, movement was not just mechanical, it was adaptive, a conversation between organism and environment that defined the first fully terrestrial predators. Interactions with other invertebrates demonstrated early competition for food and territory, highlighting the complexity of nascent terrestrial ecosystems. Multiple species jostled for limited resources, while some were forced to retreat into shadows or burrows, learning early lessons in avoidance, timing, and strategic movement. Dominance was established not merely by size, but through coordination, efficiency, and the capacity to exploit both physical and temporal niches. In this competitive dance, natural selection favored those that could integrate environmental perception with predatory skill, giving rise to behaviors that would define arthropod ecology for millions of years. Sensory adaptations enabled the detection of subtle air currents, vibrations, and chemical traces, creating a rich awareness of its environment far beyond mere vision. The scorpion's antennae and leg hairs served as mechanosensory extensions, translating minute oscillations in soil and air into actionable data. Chemical cues allowed recognition of prey, mates, and potential threats, adding a layer of sophistication to hunting strategies. Even at this early stage, predation on land was a multi-dimensional activity, demanding integration of multiple sensory channels to achieve success. These adaptations illustrate how life could not merely survive on land, it could actively manipulate and interpret the environment to its advantage. The combination of armored exoskeleton, venomous appendage, and stealthy locomotion ensured both predatory efficiency and defense against emerging competitors. Segmentation provided both flexibility and resilience, allowing rapid directional changes while withstanding minor abrasions and environmental hazards. The tail served a dual purpose, simultaneously a defensive weapon and a tool for subduing prey. Every structural adaptation amplified the scorpion's effectiveness in this novel habitat, demonstrating that the conquest of land involved not just locomotion or respiration, but also offensive and defensive strategies that reshaped ecological interactions. Each successful capture reinforced the evolutionary advantage of fully terrestrial hunting, showing that independence from water could be paired with ecological dominance. The abundance of small, air-breathing prey provided both sustenance and a testing ground for increasingly sophisticated predatory strategies. Patterns of stalking, striking, and retreat became finely tuned, enabling repeated success even under variable environmental conditions. These interactions set a precedent for the evolution of complex predator-prey dynamics, where intelligence, sensory integration, and physical specialization intertwined to shape the terrestrial ecosystem. In mastering both stealth and strike on dry land, these early scorpions set a precedent for arthropods that would eventually sever all ties with aquatic life, shaping the dynamics of terrestrial ecosystems for generations to come. The first predators had transformed the landscape from a simple stage for passive life into a theatre of interaction, risk, and opportunity. Their presence ensured that survival on land would require more than respiration or locomotion. It demanded cunning, coordination, and the capacity to act on sensory information with precision. In these first moments of active predation, terrestrial life gained both drama and consequence, opening ecological niches that would be explored and contested by future generations of arthropods and vertebrates alike. Trigonotarbids, arachnids that never returned. With the first predators having severed ties to water, a new era of arachnid life unfolded, one fully devoted to the terrestrial realm. The shoreline, once a transitional corridor, had transformed into a permanent stage where these early arachnids could explore the possibilities of life completely independent of water. Their segmented bodies, jointed limbs, and finely tuned sensory systems combined to create a form capable of sustained land movement, far surpassing the tentative excursions of earlier tidal and semi-aquatic arthropods. Every cautious step demonstrated a growing mastery of terrain, balancing strength with precision, and revealing a lineage willing to commit fully to the solid ground. In the quiet corners of these emerging ecosystems, trigonotarbids shaped a rhythm of existence dictated by gravity, friction, and the subtle shifts of the soil beneath them. Every jointed limb extended with deliberate precision, negotiating the uneven surfaces of damp soils and littered vegetation. Coordinated motion allowed the body to adapt constantly, adjusting angles and pressure to maintain stability. Muscular contractions flowed into skeletal frameworks, producing controlled bursts of movement ideal for ambush or escape. Even minor obstacles, stones, roots, fallen branches, were negotiated seamlessly, a testament to the refinement of terrestrial locomotion. Unlike their semi-aquatic predecessors, they no longer relied on water's buoyancy to ease their movements, meaning each step was a conscious negotiation with the full weight of gravity, fully internalized in every joint and segment. The segmented body flexed rhythmically, distributing weight and enabling sudden lunges or subtle adjustments as needed. A coordinated interplay between abdomen, thorax, and appendages provided both resilience and agility. Lateral undulations of the body allowed the arachnid to maneuver through complex microhabitats, turning confined spaces into navigable corridors. The exoskeleton itself served as a dynamic frame, simultaneously offering structural support and allowing motion to propagate efficiently through the creature's form. Each muscle, tendon, and joint was optimized to respond to environmental irregularities, demonstrating that terrestrial mastery required more than simple limb presence. It demanded the full orchestration of anatomy, tuned over generations of selective pressures. Fine sensory hairs trembled with each vibration, converting whispers of movement into vital information about prey and predators alike. Airborne particles, minute shifts in humidity, and the tremor of footsteps all fed into a sensory network capable of informing split-second decisions. Navigation, hunting, and defensive behaviors were intertwined through constant feedback from the environment. This heightened perception created an intricate awareness of territory, potential food sources, and threats, establishing the first complex predator-prey interactions fully removed from aquatic influence. In these hairs and sensors, land itself became an interactive partner, shaping survival strategies and behaviors in ways impossible within water. Exoskeletal plates balance strength and flexibility, offering both protection from hazards and the capacity for agile maneuvers. Armor prevented desiccation and injury, while carefully articulated segments ensured that rigidity did not impede motion. As predators themselves, trigonotarbids could withstand accidental strikes or collisions during pursuit or ambush. Meanwhile, flexibility in joints and cuticular plates allowed rapid acceleration or subtle shifts in posture, enhancing hunting success. The combination of protection and mobility enabled a full embrace of terrestrial opportunity, where risk was constant, but survival strategies had grown sophisticated enough to mitigate it. Hunting strategies became increasingly sophisticated, relying on calculated patience, ambush positioning, and rapid bursts of movement. Trigonotarbids exploited environmental cover, using debris, vegetation, and shadows to conceal themselves from prey. When the moment was right, the arachnid's sudden strike was a study in biomechanical efficiency, transmitting force from multiple limbs to secure capture. These methods were not random, but shaped by countless iterations of trial and refinement, producing behaviors that balanced energy expenditure with reward. In mastering both stealth and strike, they established a standard for land-based predation previously unseen in arthropod history. Interactions with neighboring arthropods shaped competition and cooperation, creating microcosms of ecological complexity. Some species coexisted within the same territory, negotiating food resources and movement patterns. Others competed, forcing adaptations in speed, strategy, and awareness. Each encounter, whether confrontational or incidental, influenced the evolution of behavior and morphology, reinforcing traits that improved survival. The land, once a marginal arena for life, became a laboratory of ecological experimentation where pressures of predation, resource acquisition, and mobility intersected in intricate ways. Chemical and tactile cues guided navigation, signaling territory boundaries and facilitating reproductive behaviors in this entirely dry environment. Subtle trails left in substrate or on vegetation carried messages interpreted by sensitive receptors, creating invisible maps of occupancy and opportunity. Mating rituals, foraging strategies, and even threat displays relied on such information, ensuring that life on land was not merely about movement, but about interacting intelligently with a multi-dimensional environment. These behaviors formed the earliest complex social and ecological networks fully expressed on terrestrial surfaces. Every action demanded careful energy management, hydration, and environmental awareness, refining endurance in a land-based lifestyle. Unlike the predictable buoyancy of water, solid ground presented continuous challenges in stability, locomotion, and exposure. Trigonotarbids developed movement patterns and rest cycles that balanced exertion with conservation, ensuring survival in fluctuating temperature and humidity. Every decision, from the direction of a step to the choice of hiding spot, was a delicate negotiation with the constraints and opportunities of land. Their physiology and behavior became increasingly interdependent, demonstrating that true terrestrial adaptation required the integration of multiple biological systems. By fully embracing terrestrial existence, trigonotarbids solidified a new ecological order, one in which land was no longer a temporary refuge, but a permanent home. They were not constrained by proximity to water, no longer reliant on semi-aquatic excursions to survive or reproduce. In abandoning aquatic dependence entirely, they redefined the rules of engagement, establishing a precedent for all future arthropods and prefiguring the intricate webs of terrestrial life. Predation, navigation, and reproduction unfolded in ways previously impossible, marking a decisive evolutionary achievement. Land could now be claimed, defended, and exploited with permanence. This complete commitment of arachnids to terrestrial life highlighted a contrast with vertebrates, who still lingered at shorelines, testing gravity and structural limits cautiously. The sophistication of trigonotarbids demonstrated that once environmental and mechanical challenges were mastered, organisms could sever ancient ties to water and thrive in a fully terrestrial context. While arthropods flourished, vertebrates would soon follow, learning to lift and move their bodies beyond the margins of aquatic support, eventually crossing the same landscapes that trigonotarbids had already claimed as home. Their permanence on land underscored a critical evolutionary principle. Adaptation was not simply about survival, but about committing fully to a new way of being, laying the groundwork for the next great wave of terrestrial conquest. Hylonomus lyelli, the first crawl with no return. Beneath the dense canopy of a carboniferous forest, a small vertebrate tested the leaf-littered ground, each step a deliberate negotiation with gravity. The dim light filtered through a tangle of ferns and lycopsids, casting shadows that danced across the uneven forest floor, challenging every tentative movement. Limbs, slender yet remarkably resilient, extended and pressed into the earth with a precision honed by evolutionary pressures that demanded both stability and mobility. Unlike its aquatic ancestors, this creature relied entirely on terrestrial support. Its body weight distributed across 4 limbs that had learned to resist collapse under their own mass. Each lift and landing required micro-adjustments in posture as tiny muscles and joints absorbed the unpredictable irregularities of soil, decomposing vegetation, and scattered twigs. Muscles coiled beneath its vertebral column, transmitting force into a body capable of sustained terrestrial movement. The spine, reinforced but flexible, allowed subtle shifts in body orientation, granting both balance and the ability to maneuver around obstacles without losing momentum. As limbs alternated between propulsion and support, energy flowed efficiently from one segment to another, demonstrating an early understanding of biomechanics far beyond mere reflex. The ribs and limb girdles, though delicate compared to later tetrapods, bore weight consistently, ensuring that each step brought the animal closer to the promise of permanent land habitation. In these movements, the creature exemplified a critical transition. Gravity was no longer softened by water. It was an ever-present force to be negotiated, resisted, and ultimately mastered. Forest detritus, roots, and fallen logs became both obstacles and guides, shaping how the animal adjusted posture and pace. Tiny elevations in the substrate prompted flexion and extension of the forelimbs, while depressions required subtle rotation of the hind limbs to maintain balance. The creature's eyes and sensory organs remained vigilant, scanning the floor for shifts in shadow, texture, and potential threats. Every subtle environmental cue was integrated into real-time movement, allowing rapid adaptation to the unpredictability of terrestrial terrain. These interactions illustrate the delicate choreography required for life outside of water. Survival depended not only on structural integrity, but on constant perception and instantaneous decision-making. Limbs extended and retracted with subtle timing, distributing weight across multiple contact points to maintain stability. Each step was a study in force management, with claws and digits pressing against soil and decomposing matter to prevent slipping. The vertebrate's forelimbs absorbed forward momentum, while hind limbs provided both thrust and braking as the animal negotiated uneven surfaces. Small shifts in balance were corrected by minute rotations of the vertebral column, coordinated with micro-adjustments in limb position. Through these careful movements, the creature demonstrated that limbs could evolve from simple aquatic paddles into instruments capable of deliberate terrestrial exploration. Eyes and sensory organs scanned constantly, integrating visual and tactile feedback to navigate the dim, humid environment. Receptors in the skin, particularly along the underside of the body, detected vibrations from shifting leaves and the movements of other organisms. This constant feedback loop allowed the animal to react instantly to both threats and opportunities, whether avoiding a collapsing branch or approaching small invertebrates as potential prey. Coordination between vision, tactile sensation, and locomotion exemplified a sophisticated level of environmental awareness, indicating that permanent terrestrial life required more than mere support structures. It demanded an entire suite of sensory-motor adaptations. Energy expenditure was managed carefully, with short bursts of movement punctuated by pauses, ensuring endurance across the forest floor. Each period of motion tested the limits of the muscular and skeletal system, while brief stillness allowed recovery and assessment of surroundings. This pattern of exertion and pause created a rhythm optimized for survival in a novel, gravity-dominated ecosystem. It also highlights the interplay between physiology and environment, showing that early terrestrial vertebrates were not only structurally adapted, but also behaviorally tuned to the demands of fully land-based life. Interactions with small invertebrates provided both nutrition and lessons in predator-prey dynamics unique to dry ground. Coordinated lunges and precise strikes required fine-tuned control over limb extension, grip, and timing. The animal's small size allowed stealth and maneuverability, while its growing understanding of terrestrial mechanics enabled successful hunting in an environment where water could no longer assist in buoyancy or concealment. Each encounter reinforced the evolutionary advantages of mobility, control, and spatial awareness, shaping the lineage that would go on to colonize forests, floodplains, and eventually all terrestrial ecosystems. The vertebrate's skeletal framework absorbed shocks, maintained stability, and allowed nimble adjustments without the support of water. The limbs acted not just as supports, but as tools of exploration, capable of probing crevices, adjusting posture, and compensating for substrate inconsistencies. The spine's flexibility worked in concert with limb positioning, allowing the body to twist, extend, and brace as needed. This integration of skeletal, muscular, and sensory systems reveals a holistic approach to terrestrial survival, one where coordination was as critical as raw strength. The forest floor became a proving ground, testing every aspect of anatomy and behavior in an environment previously inaccessible to vertebrates. Each movement demonstrated the transformation of limbs, from tools of support to instruments of exploration and survival. With each lift, each push, and each carefully timed step, the vertebrate began to exploit niches that aquatic ancestors could not reach. The combination of structural competence, energy management, and environmental awareness allowed for a consistency of movement previously impossible outside water. In mastering these challenges, the creature paved the way for later vertebrates to move faster, explore farther, and eventually dominate terrestrial landscapes. Confidently traversing the forest floor, the animal exemplified the transition from experimental excursions to a permanent terrestrial lifestyle. Its cautious exploration had become deliberate, its limbs capable of carrying it over obstacles and through dense vegetation without retreating to water. Survival no longer required partial submersion. The forest itself became home, offering shelter, food, and opportunities for reproduction in a fully terrestrial context. This moment signifies the culmination of millions of years of anatomical experimentation. Vertebrates had at last succeeded in making land a viable and permanent habitat. What began as hesitant pushes at the shoreline had, at last, become a confident crawl into an entirely new world, one that future life would no longer merely test, but inhabit. The shadowed Carboniferous forests now hosted the first truly terrestrial vertebrates, whose structural ingenuity, muscular control, and sensory integration allowed them to claim land as their own. Every subtle shift of limb, every careful adjustment of the spine, every measured pause for balance marked a lineage poised to radiate into the diverse forms that would come to dominate terrestrial ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years. In these small, determined movements, the blueprint for land life was set, proving that the evolutionary gamble of leaving water behind could succeed and forever changed the trajectory of life on Earth. The first tentative crawls across mud and sand were more than movement. They were courage incarnate, a subtle defiance of a world that demanded adaptation at every step. Life stretched beyond water's cradle, feeling the pull of gravity, the friction of soil, and the promise of open air. In these fragile excursions, the blueprint for all terrestrial life was etched, the whispering of possibilities yet to come. The echoes of those first footsteps linger in every forest, tidal flat, and riverbank today. If this journey through the dawn of land captured your curiosity, feel free to like, subscribe, or share your thoughts below.